Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the July 20th, 2022 Worcester Township Board of Supervisors business meeting. Would you please join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance? My name is Rick DiLello. I'm the chairman of the board. To my left is Lou Betts, who's our vice chair. To my right is Steve Quigley, who is our third member. On the front table, we have Bob Brandt, who is our township solicitor, and on the back table, we have Tommy Ryan, who is our township manager. First and foremost, does anybody have any informational items for the board this evening?
This evening's meeting is being video recorded for rebroadcast.
Thank you, Tommy. First item on our agenda tonight is public comment. We do ask that you limit your public comment to 5 minutes. Does anybody have any public comment for the board tonight?
Cindy Smith, 3102 Fisher Road. Good to see you on this sweltering hot summer night. We should all be at the beach, but here we are taking care of business. The last time that we met, Bob Fesnack presented you with 947 signed petitions. Bob would be here tonight, but he is quarantining. The petition that 947 people signed was in favor of having a referendum vote on the November ballot. Here's what the petition said. Petition of support for a referendum to consider an open space fund in Worcester Township. We, the undersigned voters of Worcester Township, request that an open space referendum be submitted to Worcester residents on the November 2022 election ballot. The referendum would allow voters to decide if they want a dedicated open space fund and a related funding source. The sole purpose of such funds would be to acquire land, development rights, and to maintain parks and recreational areas. 947 people signed their name to this idea. That is a significant amount of people. I was at several polling places getting signatures, and everybody was in favor that we talked to. We had volunteers at all 4 polling places with the petitions, talking to people from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. The people who signed this and the people who are speaking to you tonight, like myself, are passionate enough about keeping this area rural, agricultural, and historic. That's what makes Worcester special. I encourage you to do what the people want.
Thank you, Cindy. We appreciate your comments. Does anybody else have any public comment for the board at this time? Jim?
Jim Alec, Worcester. I just heard about this petition with 900 plus names. Do you guys know who gathered those names on that petition? Was it a group? Was it an organization? Or did a bunch of random people just decide to go ahead and collect it? Do you guys know?
So I'm not sure if it was specifically a group. It was a group of individuals that were sitting at each of the different polling places throughout the day and rotating throughout the day. I don't know if it was specifically structured as an organization, but it was an organized group of people, is I guess the best way I would describe it.
Do you know if an organization was behind the group that gathered the petition?
I don't offhand, Jim, no.
Do you? Anybody? Maybe somebody can clear that up. I've heard numerous things about who was behind it. Be good to find out, who was the motivating factor behind it. I'll point out again, there was no other viewpoint presented to the voters on election day. I know I was working the polls, and my goal was to elect our Republican candidates. The goal for this group of people was to get this thing through, get this idea through, which brings me to, where did this idea for a referendum come from? Did you guys think it up?
Well, it came up a couple of years ago. I don't know if,
Well, this one we're talking about now.
well, I brought it up earlier this year. I asked us to have a work session. I think it was either our January or our February meeting. So I asked for it to be put on a work session. It was on a work session in April. So
So out of the clear blue, you decided, you know what? I think it's time to talk about a referendum that we said was going to be during the presidential election?
So we said a lot of things over the last couple of years, and in this particular case, so for me, the triggering point was in January, Whitpain Township decided to put an open space referendum on their ballot in May. That was sort of my triggering event at the beginning of the year. And I did a little bit of research with that and thought it was a good idea for us to discuss it again. You're right, when we did speak a couple of years ago, we did talk about trying to target a presidential election, and I think we really couldn't anticipate what was going to happen with the pandemic and COVID-19, which sort of, the best laid plans,
Yeah, but
if you will.
But COVID-19, the pandemic, inflation, and all the rest of this stuff is not impacting the presidential election, which is going to have the highest turnout. What you just said is correct. All that stuff is a problem now, not when you guys anticipated doing it, which is the presidential election, which makes sense. So I guess what I'm asking is, did people write you and petition you to go forward with this? People either called you, emailed you, wrote you, and said, hey, we should do this? And then you went ahead and said, you know what, let's put it on the agenda?
So I would say that I brought it up before those emails started to arrive, but we've gotten a smattering of calls and emails and different things. But I would say that I brought the issue up first because I knew it had come up previously and anticipated it would be coming up again.
Okay. See, and my problem is, if you heard the first speaker and the way she presented what this thing is different than how I would present it, because what you're going to do is put this on the referendum for us to get taxed up to a couple $100. If this thing goes through, our taxes are going up at least $100, maybe $200, our local taxes, okay? And that's what I'd be telling voters, that, hey, this thing is a tax, and we've already been overtaxed $18 million here with the surplus that you guys just bought $2 million of open space with. So I'll get to the rest of it when it comes time for your vote. I got a list of the donors to the voluntary fund, open space fund,
Yep.
as of June the 4th. I'm looking at this list. There's no Winnie Hayes. There's no Rob Hayes. There's no Kim David. There's no Bert Hines. Now, there is Jim Mollick, Steve and Donna Quigley, Todd and Kelsey Givler. Where's the people that advocate for open space, putting money into the fund? Well, they want everybody else to pay for their personal agenda. And I'll have more to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. We appreciate your comments. Deb?
Deb Walker, 2931 Clyston Road. I just can't let that go.
Can you talk
I'm-
on the mic?
Do me a favor, if you could pull that a little closer to you.
Sorry about that.
That we get you on the recording.
I have not contributed yet to the fund. I'm waiting to see if the referendum passes, because I'll already be paying. So to kind of characterize as people not caring is really not fair to those of us who are waiting. That's my only comment.
Thank you, Deb. So we take all the comments. The reason we take them all is that we try to balance them out as a board. We understand that's totally fine. Bob?
My name is Bob Held. I'm at 2096 Deep Meadow Lane in Worcester. I'm new to a lot of this. I understand that there is currently a voluntary fund that's out there. I'd like to know how much money's been contributed to that voluntary fund. I mean, this is new to me, but the reality is, I mean, if you have some success, Why do we need to tax people additional money? I mean, we're already paying, I personally am paying $16,000 of taxes in this township. And I can't tell you that I've got a lot to show for that. And the reality is, we do have an $18 million surplus right now of township funds. So why are we now going to tax all the residents to put money into a fund for open space? And what is that open space being used for? Furthermore, I happen to know that, you know, there's been some deals that have gone down. Let's talk about the fact that I used to play golf at Center Square Golf Course. Guess what? That was a total debacle, and, you know, there's all kinds of things going on with that. And that was great open space that a lot of people had a lot of use out of and is now homes. So the reality is, and it wasn't done appropriately, the reality is to tax every resident when we already have a surplus for open space that you can't show me, and how's it gonna get regulated? Who's gonna regulate it? You guys? I mean, the reality is, don't you regulate it now? Don't you regulate the $18 million surplus that you have? Why do we have to have more money put into surplus? Why can't we use the money that we already have? And if this fund is so valuable and these people are so passionate about it, how come, I'd like to know what the balance in that fund is. I'll bet you it's not very high.
Well, Bob, we don't actually have, so we have money that's earmarked not to a committed, so let me back up a sec. So we are a fund accounting-driven township as a municipality. So there's money in our capital fund that's specific for capital projects. There are certain things that certain funds are restricted for certain ways. Other funds are not. So money that might be in what we have allocated as an open space fund is not required to be spent on open space. It's just a way for us from an accounting perspective to allocate funds in certain ways. So what we call unrestricted as a particular fund. If we chose to move forward with this particular referendum and it passed, then you would have a restricted fund that had funds that were specifically allocated for that.
Didn't you just spend $2 million on 40 acres?
So we did just, well, we're in the process of acquiring
Okay,
at this juncture.
okay. But my point is,
Yep.
is that we have more than sufficient money available for open space. Do we not?
I'm going to hold that comment, Bob, if I can, until we kind of have a more open discussion on when we get to that agenda item.
Okay.
That's
I mean, I would like a lot more input into how that's going to be managed and everything else, so we don't end up with another Center Square debacle.
Okay, well, the Center Square debacle, as you described, was a little bit different, but again, I'm happy to
Okay,
discuss.
it didn't go down the way it was supposed to go down, and I'll let it go at that. Thanks.
Fair enough. Does anybody else have any public comment for the board at this juncture? Okay, seeing none, we will move on. First official action item on our agenda tonight is actually our consent agenda. First and foremost, does any board member wish to remove any items from our consent agenda tonight? Nope. Okay. Seeing none, then if somebody would like to make a motion, I will entertain one for the consent agenda.
So I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda, treasurer's report, bill payment, work session minutes, and business meeting minutes for June 15.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, and for the motion, the actual amount of the bills for June 2022 is going to be $357,873.14. So it's been moved and seconded. Is there any public comment regarding the motion that's on the floor? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Aye. Motion passes. Next up, we have the public hearing, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob to both open the meeting and then sort of explain sort of how this process will proceed.
Thank you. Welcome this evening. As you can see, we have a court reporter present. When we adopt certain ordinances here in Worcester, we like to keep a transcribed record of the proceedings. This is a hearing on a proposed ordinance 2022-291, which is an ordinance of the Board of Supervisors that provides for a question to be placed before the voters of Worcester by referendum at the general election on the November 8th, 2022, which asks, whether the electors of the township favor the imposition of an increase in the rate of the property tax by 1/2 mil to be used to acquire real property or interest therein, or to pay any associated transactional or maintenance costs for the purposes of securing open space benefits as authorized by the Open Space Lands Act. I'm first going to mark a couple exhibits indicating that on June 13, 2022, the ordinance was sent to the Times-Herald. The ordinance was placed on the lobby and posted to the website on the 17th. It was sent to the Times-Herald and Montgomery County Law Library on the 13th of June. Legal ads were published on June 28, July 5, and July 12, and the hearing is this evening. The process of a referendum, as directed by the board for us to prepare a ordinance for their consideration, is a referendum for a $0.5 mil increase of real estate tax for open space purposes. It's on tonight's agenda. And if the voters, if the ordinance is approved by the board this evening, it would place the referendum on the ballot on November 8th. And if the voters would approve it on November 8th, the tax would be effective on January 1st, 2023. And if approved, no changes in the tax can be made in 5 years. The $0.5 mil increase to the real estate tax would generate approximately $504,000 per year, and those numbers have come internally through staff for information. And there's legislation that was passed on June 20th of 2022 that allows local governments to maintain open space with some of those funds. That wasn't the situation earlier. So very simply, there are the exhibits to the hearing.
Yep.
That's a brief explanation. The ordinance itself is not very long or complicated. It recites in the whereas clauses everything that I said, and then has a very sort of a plain language explanation for the voters to explain to them what the question on the ballot is. And I'm going to read the question again so everybody hears it again. The question that would appear on the ballot if the board adopts this ordinance this evening would be, do you favor the imposition of an increase in the real estate tax rate for Worcester Township residents from its current rate of 0.05 mil to 0.55 mil to be imposed by the township with the revenues generated to be used to acquire interest in real property in Worcester or retire indebtedness incurred in purchasing interest in real estate for open space benefit, to pay transactional fees that are incidental to the acquisition, and to pay expenses necessary to prepare the required resource, recreation, or land use plan for the property, and finally, to develop, improve, design, or engineer, or maintain the property. That's what would appear on the ballot if the board adopts the ordinance this evening. Now, it would be appropriate for any public comment on the proposed ordinance, and because it's a hearing with a court reporter, I think it would be easier for him if anybody that has question or that would have comment on this matter to sit there and provide comment. So I'm going to do this as I used to do it at the zoning board. I'm going to go left to right, and if you want to make a comment, please raise your hand, come up, identify yourself. The court reporter will swear you in, and then you can say very succinctly your position on the any public comment that you have on the matter. So let's try it. Is that okay with you?
That's fine with me.
Okay, so let's go left to right. I used to go right to left, but I'm left to right now. So let's go left to right. Raise your hand. There's no obligation to say anything at all, but you're certainly welcome to do it. Sir. It's Jay.
Yes, if you could, so,
Yep.
yeah, if you just sign in there, Jay, and then when you go to speak, just make sure you get the mic right close to you and that Tom has a chance to hear you to get you on the official hearing. And
My name is Jay McKeever. I'm at Defford Road in Worcester. Defford Road? I do. And mine is just a question. In reading the question that you just read, Bob, it says the current rate of .05. I think that's a typo. I think the current
Oh,
rate
it
is
is.
0.5.
Yes, it is a typo. Thanks. Thank you.
From .05 to .55, you're here.
Mistake I made all year. Thank you, Jay. Anybody else on the left-hand side of the room? Oh, yep.
Burt, B-U-R-T-H-Y-N-E-S, Worcester. I do. You're hearing a lot of rhetoric tonight, but I want to take a moment to say thank you to the three supervisors for putting this question on the ballot. You're here tonight to vote on putting it on the ballot and letting the voters decide in November. I think that's very fair. I don't know what the outcome will be. I may have my own bias in terms of what I'd like the outcome to be, but you're using the democratic process to get an answer from this community. Some of us will come in and say, yes, we're in favor. Others will come in and say, we're not in favor. You're allowing democracy to work. So there's no vote tonight on whether there'll be a tax increase or not. The voters will make that decision in November, and I think that's most important. And again, I applaud you for it, and thank you.
So folks, I appreciate your passion on the issue. I'd ask, we're in a public hearing, in a public meeting, that we try to refrain, because somebody may say something you don't agree with, and we don't want to have the cat calls either, ultimately. So we appreciate the clapping, but if we could minimize that, it would be appreciated.
Winnie had her hand up also.
I do. Okay, you don't need my name. You got it. Yes, you got it. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for considering this referendum. And I want to echo Bert's comments about our republic, our democracy, and how important it is to allow people to make decisions about taxation. If we go back to the Revolutionary War, taxation without representation was one of the issues that drove the revolution. And so I really want to applaud you for doing that. I also want to point out that, and ask some questions just to clarify for the record. 0.05, if you look at the average real estate tax in this township, is about, and I'll look to Tommy because I know you looked into it, but it's about $120 per year. Do you have that number, Tommy? The taxation, 0.05 mils, works out on average about $120 per household per year. Okay, we worked it out. So it's roughly in that range, so it's relatively small. Where does most of our taxes come from for the township to run it? It comes from earned income tax?
That's correct.
And how much do we bring in each year per household on average? Any
Well, I
idea?
don't know, I'm not sure what it is per household because it's driven based on income per individual, but it's approximately $3 million a year in total tax receipts.
Okay, so people pay considerably more for their township support through earned income, and the vast majority of the real estate tax goes to the school district. And I can't cite right now what the total mills are, but my guess is it's well over 30. Does anybody know what the mills are on the real estate tax now? Steve or anybody?
I don't understand what your question is.
I'm just saying proportionately 0.5 mills as compared to the total millage for real estate
So
tax.
the total millage, it's over 90% that goes to the school, and it's maybe about 80 to 85 to the school. There's another 10 to 15%. The bulk of that goes to the county. So the county gets a small slice, the school district gets the largest slice, and the township's portion today is, pennies on a dollar.
Right. And in fact, there is approximately the same amount we're talking about taxing for the open space that's also taxed countywide to support the Montgomery County Community College. So we're paying a tax already on that order. So I'm just really pointing out that relatively speaking, that amount of money is relatively small. And to address the upcoming election, as you stated, we planned to have it during a presidential election, and then COVID hit, and it obviously wasn't the right time to do it. Given the level of division going on in this country today and the political climate, all pundits are expecting that the turnout in the fall will be very large. So the representation at that turnout should be, at that election should be relatively large as well. And I'd like to encourage you to continue on, vote to put the referendum on the ballot, and let the people decide. And both those that oppose it and those that support it over the next several months can communicate with the township about the value or the lack of value, but let the people decide. Thank you.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Is there anybody else on the left-hand side of the room with testimony? Let's switch over to the right-hand side of the room. We're going to go front to back. Nobody in the front row. Sir? I forget your name.
Bob.
Bob.
Held, H-E-L-D. I do. Thank you. Listen, you guys have a thankless job, and I appreciate everything you do. I really do. I mean, I've been on committees. I've done what you've done. I get it. But we've got $18 million surplus. Now you want to tax the township another $500,000. You can't. Haven't even spent the $18 million. You tell me how valuable this is, this hearing, and this referendum is. You put it in the paper. You told us how all these people were notified. There's not 50 people here. It can't be that important. I'm sorry, it just cannot be that important. And the reality is, if everybody knew this was a tax, because it's sort of the way that it's been presented to people is, hey, let's keep open space. And they're not really telling them it's an additional tax. It is a tax. And you got $18 million already of our money, which means, the pennies that you said, Rick, have added up to quite a sizable amount of money because you got $18 million surplus. Good for you. That's great. You guys have done a great job managing. We don't need to tax us another $500,000 for open space. We just don't need it. So I appreciate what you did, but this tax is ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw another hand or two over there. Yes, hi. Nancy?
Yes, I do. Nancy Threlfall, Fieldcrest Way. Nancy Threlfall, T-H-R-E-L-F-A-L-L. Our family is in support of putting a referendum on the ballot, so thank you. One question I have is the language that's used in the referendum, as I have been told, has to be particularly precise and follow guidelines from, I guess, it's the state. But I don't think it really helps the general citizen understand what it means to their pocketbook. What's $500,000? What's 0.55 mil? We now, based on some research, believe it's somewhere everybody's going to be paying approximately $115 to $120 more, depending on what their situation is. Why can we not explain the relevancy of what that mill means in terms of dollars? Because I think, up until my getting involved in this, I had no clue. And now I understand I'll be paying another more, maybe $100, $115 more a year to have the benefit of an environment that is really important to me, to our household, to my daughter and her household, and to a lot of the people who live in this community. So my question, the question is, why can we not be more specific in the language of the referendum to help explain what the reality is?
Well, I'll try to answer it, but I think the way I read the referendum question, I think it's very clear that it's either a yes or no based on the language. What you're asking for is for the ordinance to include a calculation of an average, and that the law
Yeah, the
doesn't.
dollars and cents.
Yeah, the law doesn't.
Say this, it's approximately an additional $50 to $200, depending on the value of your property, depending on your, whatever it's dependent upon.
Right, so you're restricted, Nancy, and it was Bob was starting to say, we're restricted by the law and what we can put in the,
The statute tells you what the language has to be. So if you want to do your own calculation or ask maybe the township for a rough calculation, do that, but the law does not permit that language to appear there.
Okay.
unfortunately, I understand your question, but ultimately we're walking down the specific line that tells us how to do it, and that's the language that has to be, that we need to decide, first off, if we're going to do it, and then.
It doesn't mean that you don't have a good idea. It's just that when you're constrained to do something a certain way by state statute, that's the way I have to do it.
Okay, understood. Thank you. I also want to say, I have a minute left, that if we provide a larger war chest for open space in the township, it could help eliminate some of the angst, the division, the legal financial aggravation that many of us have been up against regarding the Palmer property. So in the future, smaller plots of land, medium plots, larger plots, perhaps we have the money and the citizens agree that that's the way the money should be applied, then we won't have all this divisive issue in the township. So I think it's a very relevant question to ask the community. And just because there aren't 50 people here doesn't mean that there are a lot of people who support this, could potentially support the referendum, and at least support having it on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
The right-hand side of the room, Jim Malik.
I do. Jim Malik, Worcester. A couple things to remember. This tax isn't a one-time tax. It's this year, it's next year, it's the following year, it's the following year. And it's not the only tax. Because guess what? School district going up almost 2%. County tax going up. Local tax going up. So, you know, when you say it's only 100 to 150, and you add that to 200 or 300 for the school district, and then more for the county, and you end up with $600–700 of tax increases just from that alone, just from the tax situation. The point is, we already have $18 million in the bank to buy open space, and the reason we have $18 million is we're overtaxed. That's the only way you can have a surplus. And the reason we're overtaxed is because, as pointed out, the 0.5% earned income tax that the school district collects and gives to you guys is constant. Nobody ever cuts it down. So every year you got the same amount of money, or percentage-wise, and if you get more money, guess what happens? It goes into your reserve fund or your general fund, and that's why you ended up with $18 million. What should have happened is that tax rate should have been lowered, So you weren't getting the big surpluses, and we wouldn't have 18 million sitting in the bank. So now people want to give more or tax the residents more in addition to being overtaxed 18 million. It makes no sense. For you guys, it's political suicide. And the time we're living in right now is an absolute contraindication to doing it. Now, I gotta point out here, people have said we're living in a democracy. We're not living in a democracy. This is a representative republic. Because if we were living in a true democracy, the mob would rule, and you guys wouldn't be up here because we wouldn't need you, because everything would be our vote. And the founders, for good reason, didn't go with a straight democracy for just that reason. If you really want people to make decisions about taxation and make their own decisions, then put an addendum in that motion or ordinance that allows people to opt out of paying the tax. Because this is all about people's choice, right? I heard somebody say, you know, taxation, allow people to have a say and make a decision about this. Well, why don't you let people make that decision and put an addendum in there that allows people to opt out? Shouldn't be a problem because everybody says, oh, everybody's for open space. Everybody wants to get taxed more. Okay, good. Let them pay their tax, but let some people who don't want to pay the tax opt out. What's the problem with that? That's what I'd recommend you do. If you're going to go forward, let senior citizens who $150 means something to opt out. You know, let people who are struggling in their business, got laid off or whatever, opt out. Let people who are getting nailed by 9% inflation opt out. If you really want to be, you know, about choice and giving people the opportunity to do it, then that's what I would do. You cannot go forward with this referendum. And the reason, there's multiple reasons. I already mentioned that you already have $18 million in the bank. That's from overtaxation. And you already used $2 million of it to purchase 40 acres. I have a list of all of your inventory. Do you guys have any idea what inventory you have and what you can afford to purchase or not? So I think the answer is no. I mean, I have an idea, but nobody here seems to want to talk about the inventory list. For example, you have like, there's one property at 119 acres. We can't afford to buy 119 acres. I mean, you use 100 grand an acre, and that's a low figure. That's 10 million bucks. There's another one, 128 acres. That's 12 million bucks. So they're on the inventory, but we can't buy that stuff. It's ridiculous. So I took out the properties under 30 and over 70 acres. And I came up with, you got 11 properties left that are possible. And one of those 11 is Worcester Golf Course, okay? But some of the ones I took out on the low side, 11.7, 10, 8 acres. So, I mean, you have properties in there that are not good buys, okay? I mean, you know, if these folks had their druthers, they'd buy everything. Because the goal, see, the thing I found out, I was working the polls on election day. I talked to two people who claimed they were friends of Worcester people. And I'm like, why are you guys doing all this? What I was told was to prevent new voters from coming into the township. That's what I was told, okay? Now, yeah, and maybe they're right, and maybe they're wrong. But certainly, there's a few people out there who think the reason you preserve this open space is so you don't get new voters, and you continue to keep doing what you're doing in perpetuity, with how things work here in the township. That's all going to change, though, in the next 4 years. Pretty sure that's going to change. So the reason you cannot go forward, you got inflation at 9%, you got gasoline at $5 a gallon, you got the stock market in the tank, you got 401ks decimated, and now we're heading for a recession. And you guys are going to entertain raising taxes? Because you're the guys that are going to put it on the, you're abdicating your responsibility. I mean, if you wanted to, you could create it. Because that's what representative republics do. We elect you to make those decisions. Now you're going to say, oh, let's just throw it on the voters. Well, you're throwing something on the voters right now who have been getting the shaft. Voters aren't happy, and they're not going to be happy moving forward with this. The second reason that you can't go forward with this is because of all the stuff that's happened in this township regarding open space and how it's been managed. Okay? What's that? How it's been managed. And we go back to early history. John Harris, who was the first open space coordinator, I believe, he ends up being the first property that we purchased the development rights to. Okay? And apparently he carved off some acreage off of that. You got, more recently, you got the situation with Susan Coughlin, who was a supervisor while she's representing a client who had business before the township. And there was an ethics violation and determination based upon that problem. You've got the Center Square Golf Course, another example of open space that we should have never had to let go. I was told by the owner, Fran Petrini, and I've presented this to you guys maybe a year or two ago, but the owner said that he spoke to Susan Coughlin, told them about his situation at the golf course. They had a meeting, and at that meeting, he asked or proposed to develop the driving range in exchange for keeping the golf course open, keeping 100 acres. So develop 10, or whatever the driving range is, to save 100. Well, guess what? Susan Coughlin, Supervisor Coughlin, Friends of Worcester, Susan Coughlin, told him no. And she didn't tell the board, according, well, you guys would know. My understanding is she didn't tell the board, and she didn't tell the public. I mean, what would you guys have done knowing this individual would want to save the golf course in exchange for developing the driving range? That's something we'll never know. But that piece got thrown out the window because we had a single supervisor acting basically on behalf of the township. So you have multiple issues with open space, acquisition of open space, how it's being managed. And until you correct these problems and do an investigation, there's no way we should be doing a referendum to get more money to buy more open space and have it be squandered. You know, you made at least, or not you, but the board, at least 3 or 4 purchases of open space that was under the limit prescribed by the state. Now, I think it was 50 acres. That was the limit. And because these properties were adjoining, that's how they got around the minimum requirement. Well, how does that all happen? How do we end up with 3, at least 3 that I know of, that we can't go on, we can't enjoy, you can't play ball? All they are retirement funds for the people that are in the house. So until you get a handle on what happened here, there's just no way you guys can go down the road with this thing. Thanks.
Anybody else? Yes. Name and address. Ma'am, name and address so he can swear you in.
Amy Gooden, Goodin, 1149 Valley Forge Road. Yes, sir. Just going to say a couple things. Everybody has their own opinion. And we know some may be good, some may be bad. But in this day and age, yes, everything's going up. But being a single individual with a home on Valley Forge Road that I've been in 24 years, I didn't have children. That was my choice. But I've paid school taxes, never complained. I'm one person in my home. I pay $134, just like a family of 6, for the sewer bill. I don't complain. I pay my bills. I was laid off. I've had cancer. I've not worked overtime in the 24 years I've been in my home, but I've continued to pay my bills. So my point to all of you is, you do have a very challenging job. We appreciate you, and I would appreciate the referendum being put on the ballot so that the other township members can make their choices. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Anybody else? Let's indicate there's no further public comment. Does the board have any comment? Or would you like to close the hearing?
So I guess I have a question for that, Bob. I mean, ultimately, the next item on the agenda would be
We would
close the hearing. I guess where would be appropriate for us to make comments?
Now.
Now would be,
Well,
or would it be,
let's put it this way. If you have public comment on the ordinance, now would be the time to talk about that. If you want to deliberate and talk about what you've heard, you can do that separately from the public hearing. You can do that as you deliberate.
okay, I'd say it's
It's up to you.
6 on one, half dozen on the other. I'd say it's more deliberative.
I'll let you folks
And-
decide how you want to do that.
Well, do either of you, first I would ask if either one of you would want to make any sort of a comment while we have the hearing open, or just sort of when we discuss the topic after we close the hearing.
Well, now's the problem. Now's the time to probably make the comments before the hearing closed. I mean, then it's part of the record.
Okay.
Then it's a record.
Okay, then I'll start in terms of that, and on the record. I'll start there.
Go ahead.
That's fair enough. So I'm going to try not to meander too much, but obviously there's a lot of points that get brought up. You know, Jim talked about that we're a representative republic, not a true democracy in the traditional sense, and you're correct. But we also have a mechanism with items like a referendum that, you know, the pendulum oftentimes in democracy swings one way and then another. And one of the things that a referendum allows you to do is it allows you to give back on certain items to allow the population more input on certain decisions. That's sort of what its mechanism is. But you're correct, in the traditional sense, we're put up here as a board of 3 to sort of mitigate all the issues that we have to contend with as a board, both short-term expenses, long-term expenses, capital infrastructure improvements. Every year we make decisions on what roads to pave or to not pave, and every year we could turn around and we could take an additional $1 million out of the $18 million just to pave additional roads if we so chose. It's always a balance in terms of how much we keep, how much we spend. And one of the things, you know, the question for me is kicked around a variety of different ways. It started a couple of years ago when the topic was first brought up prior to the pandemic, saying, hey, give it to the voters, give it to the voters, give it to the voters. And, you know, at the time, I had to sort of be won over to some extent. Initially, I said, well, we're here to make that decision. We made a decision a couple of months ago to purchase a piece of property, and we have that capability. So you have to weigh and say, well, do we want to just sit as a board and make those decisions going forward? Well, we're not all here for lifetime terms. You know, we're every 2 years, one of us is a cycle going out. So you have to say, are we better served with a more structured mechanism? You know, I think Tommy has done an exceptional job over the last 7 years in terms of fiscal responsibility and getting our house in order as a township. And we have an audit every year that sort of reinforces that we've done a good job. To your point, Bob, you know, we've done a good job. And Jim, you've certainly been very clear that you think we collectively have overtaxed in terms of to collect that, and that you're entitled to that opinion. That's the beauty of the public comment. That's the beauty of having differing opinions. Others have said, you know, Amy just came up and talked about saying, I've had challenges over the last 24 years, and I still pay all my bills, and I think this is a good idea. So you have to, as a board, we have to decide, you know, how do we properly weigh that all out? You know, we could turn to Tommy and say, Tommy, how do we get $2 million a year for the next 10 years out of what we already have? That is a choice we could make. You know, the other choice is to say, do we put this on the ballot in the way that it's been structured and give voters an opportunity to say, this is a way I want you to do that, as opposed to waiting, you know, and I'll say the quote poorly and I'll apologize in advance, but, you know, sometimes you can't let the perfect, you know, be the enemy of good enough. And ultimately, there's never a perfect time to tax your constituents. Never. You know, there's never anybody who comes forward and says, tax me more. There's not a single, you know, I've walked these streets as you have, Jim, and Bert, you did last spring. Lou, you did last spring. Steve, you've done it. You've heard it at the farm for decades. Nobody comes forward and says, my taxes are great. You know, ultimately, we've built a community that has a tax structure that nobody likes, largely, because nobody thinks they pay not enough. Everybody thinks they pay excessive. But what we're kind of weighing here is saying, do you want to have a mechanism in place? You know, some of it is codifying in a way that says, I'm up next year. My seat is up. I have to decide whether I'm going to run or not. The voters have to decide whether they want 6 more years of me or whether they want somebody else. Ultimately, if you put something in place that outweighs the board, you know, so as the board cycles through, you know, you have this in place to make that determination and decision. You know, the 947, you know, we have to take that with some degree, Cindy, with due respect, with a grain of salt, because you can't, you know, when you do data analysis, you can't ever make it perfect. You know, you just can't. The system's not, you know, as a couple of individuals said, how did you ask the question? Did you present opposing evidence? Did you, you know, no. I mean, you get somebody as they're coming in and you get them coming out, but it's not 0 people either. You know, so we have to weigh and say 947, you know, how clean is that data? It's one piece of what we look at. But, you know, what I kept coming back and circling back to is saying, when you have a structured program, we put in place an open space program earlier this year to take some of the decision-making out of the board, you know, to give it to the township office in a way where folks can make donations and feel comfortable that it's not a backroom deal. It's an opportunity for you to donate money by choice, specifically for that purpose. We as a board could turn around and say, let's take $500,000 every year and specifically earmark it for open space. There were times where we used to take donations from residents in that regard. And if we were fortunate enough to have a benefactor that said, hey, I love that you're taking volunteer funds, I'm gonna make a very significant, you know, endowment to the community, and if somebody did that, you know, it might take away a need for a dedicated funding source. You know, in the 20-some-odd years that I've lived in Worcester, we've had 3 recessions that we count. We had, you know, the Great Recession of 2008. We've had a number of, you know, you can always make the argument that it's not the right time. You always can. You know, we talked about the presidential election, and the intent was to get to the largest pool of voters. That if you got a majority of the largest group of voters in an election cycle, you could feel better that it really was a majority that thought it was a good idea, ultimately. You know, and Nancy commented about what's a mill, you know, how much is that? And, you know, the law sort of restricts us a little bit in how firm we can do that. You know, I don't think it's perfect. I think you can make an argument against. I think you can make an argument for, but I do sort of stop and say, I'm okay with giving this piece of it to the voters. I am. I mean, and I'm sure there's some people that wouldn't like that. And I'm doing that coming into what would be my election year. So I'm putting myself in that position and recognizing what that might mean ultimately. It's at the end of the day, I don't know that it's perfect. I know we could discuss it for another 2 years till we got to the presidential cycle, and then there'd be some reason why it wouldn't be good then if we wanted to make that argument why it wasn't a good idea. I think it's a good way for us as a community to say, if people are really for it, as a property tax, that's the largest group of residents in our community contribute to a property tax versus an earned income tax. That's why I was supportive of doing it as a property tax. Ultimately, it's a small enough amount, I felt, that nobody's gonna love it, but it's a small enough amount where we can accumulate some funds every year and feel comfortable that we have a fund source that has that purpose. It doesn't go to the sewer fund, it doesn't go to our capital fund. If we suddenly have to deal with, the fire company decides we have a volunteer problem, we need to start hiring full-time firefighters. We don't know when that day will happen, but it'll happen at some point because we've gone from half a million volunteers to 125,000 across the state in the last 20 years. A day will come where that bill will come due. So some of that 18 million is sitting for that day that we don't know when it's gonna be. This, again, I don't love, and it is a tax. Jim, to your point, that's the reality. We can call it a funding source. We can talk it, earmark it for open space. It's a small tax to residents to have that opportunity. I got behind it. I had it put on our agenda. We talked about it. I thought we came to good consensus. I understand the concerns that Steve raised. I think it was last month. It might have been 2 months ago. I'm sure that Lou probably has some concerns as well. I sometimes have concerns with these matters. I don't know that it's a perfect scenario, but I eventually came around to the point of saying, we hear a lot of anecdotal evidence about people love open space. Well, this is an opportunity for people to put their money where their mouth is. It's a tax for you to have that specific things, and if you don't want it, you vote it down. At the end of the day, you vote it down and say no. You say, no, thank you, that's enough. Figure it out with the money you have. Because the reality is we can figure it out. It just means at the expense of other things going forward. At some point, we'll have to make a tough decision in that regard. So apologies for a little bit of a rant in that regard. I mean, I think everybody has made valid points. When they come to the table and they say, hey, I think it's a good idea because of this. Hey, I think it's a terrible idea because of these 3 points. They're all valid at the end of the day because you're entitled to your stance on it, and you can paint the picture any way you want. I'm willing to stand behind it. I'm willing to support it being on the ballot and letting the voters decide. And I'm also willing to trust the other 2 guys up here with me that if they say, I don't agree with you, then it's 2 to 1. And that's just how the math works. That's why we have an odd number.
Not voting right now.
Understood. I'm just simply commenting that I'm just making a comment on that. But you are correct. It is not, we are not even at a point, we haven't even made a motion.
Right.
So I'm with you. At the moment, that's all I have to say on the matter.
Rick, I think you said a lot. And I just don't know what really to finish up with. I'll just reiterate what I said before. I questioned Bob Fesnick in a meeting we had 3 months ago, 5 different ways about making it optional. They come and they say everyone's in favor of it. And I said, if you're in favor of it, make it optional. Let the people who want to pay for it. Not a problem. You can't do it because people won't pay. Well, if they're not willing to pay, then they're not really in favor of it. They don't have the money. Maybe not in favor of it, but it's my contention money's tight. The price of gas, price of food, I've said it time and time again. I know it's only $100, $150. My wife just had a reunion, $40, $50. Some of her friends couldn't afford the $40 or $50 to live in this community to go to a high school reunion. So some of us have extra money. It's good money. Other people don't have money, have retirees. Money's tight. Everything keeps going up. They worked their whole life. They've done a lot of things. And at the end of the year, things are a little bit different. It's tighter. And I've said that. I've made my points at the meetings. I asked the people coming up about it. We've addressed the situation with Mr. Ryan. A year and a half ago, we started doing an inventory of the township properties. In conjunction with that, we started a fund drive for people to make donations. We put it out there to the township, to the people. The comment was made by Deb saying, well, I'll wait and see what happens at the referendum. It was my contention, if you're really behind something, donate to it. You know, cut the check. I've said that the county has personnel there, investment people. The state has investment people. For people willing to make a contribution, as someone said, part of your state, you want to have a legacy, you want to buy a piece of land, donate to the fund. You know, cut a check for $1 million instead of buying a beach house or something like that. Well, the beach house benefits my family. I understand that. However, the same token, if you're really behind something, giving them. There's legacy things there for people to do. I've heard the comment from people, they buy homes in Worcester because of the open space. They move here and count the open space. Well, we had recently some people made that comment to me, and they had just built on a property within the past year. They took a 45-acre farm, put $1 million, $1.5 million home on it. Now they want to preserve all the land in the township. These are the things we see. These are the emails we get as supervisors. We deal with a lot of issues here. We deal with people calling us and saying, listen, my wife's been threatened by high school people. Call the state police, and the state police say, what do you want me to do about it? I have people that call us about a multitude of things. Motorcycles in the neighborhood making all kinds of noise. Can you come out and visit the site? So I guess I'm making the comment that we deal with a lot of issues, just not this. The neighbors call us about trees falling down. A tree's going to fall down. These are the issues that we deal with. We turn it to Mr. Ryan, we talk about it, we try to come up with a conclusion. This is just another one of those items. As a supervisor, you sit there and you try to make the right decision. I think I've talked about where I feel the money could come from. A few people have talked about the $20 million, $18 million the township has. We have the money if a piece of ground comes open. I said a year ago, there's no property in the township that the township would not look to buy if it's the right place at the right time. And we did that. We pulled the trigger on a piece of property. The developers were looking at it. You know, a couple $1 million. It's the taxpayers' money. It's not our money. It was a piece of ground that it was coveted by a lot of people. It was there. We tried to do the best thing to preserve open space. But once again, I'm speaking personally about open space, and people say, you don't understand open space. My family has farmed probably most of the developments where Meadowood is, where Rick lives, all over the township in the past 100 years. They've gradually gone away because the development comes in. And then we have the new people down in
Skip back in North.
No, Whitehall Road.
Whitehall.
The 40 homes down there going well over $1 million, $1.5 million. They don't want no more development. Well, that's fine, but you just came in, now nobody else can come in after you. We have to preserve everything. You talk to the Allens who live next door who wanted to buy the property, they don't like the homes there. They wanted to buy the property, but they got outbid by the developer. So now they're stuck. Stocky Allen has to look at all those homes out his back door, and he's not real happy. But the people enjoy driving past the Allen farm, seeing that open space. Allens have to pay to preserve that property. They mow it, they take care of it, they put crops on the land. It's not cheap, so they preserve it. That's their legacy. They're willing to put their money up, a lot of money, to preserve the ground there. We personally just bought a piece of property, one of the nicer pieces in Worcester. I'll be paying, or my family will be paying for the next 20 years because we wanted to preserve a piece of property. It was 35, 38 acres. Okay, we instead of buying the beach house, we did that. You know, we could have just been satisfied with the way the Murray Meat Farm sits right now, but we said, you know what? We're about open space. We like the openness. We like the open space to do things. We're in that business, so we chose to do that. I think that's the purpose where we went to Mr. Ryan a year and a half ago, and said, listen, have a fund. Let people donate. Let you do it from your estate. If you really care about open space, donate the $100, $150. But as Bob Fesnick said, you know, people won't do it. That's why we have to make it, we can't make it optional. As Mr. Malik said, hey, he's in favor if you do it optional. Well, we can't really do an optional thing, as Bob Rand said. It doesn't work that way. So I think I've expressed my views how I feel about the thing, Rick, and it's a tough situation. I also serve on the county farm board for a number of years, so I see the properties coming up, who wants to preserve them. I know the mechanics and the investment process that needs to go into buying this open space. the neighbors always think it's a good idea for the township to buy the ground. When the farm board approaches the landowner, you know, you're looking maybe $1 million, $1.5 million, much like the property next to Allen's. When the landowner can get $4 or $5 million for it, it doesn't work. The numbers aren't there for the township or the county to offer a lot more than the property's worth. We had that misconception here with the open space money that the township could sweeten the pot on open space money. If a landowner is offered $17,000 an acre for a ground when it's appraised to preserve it, we, the township, can't go in and offer another $4,000 or $5,000. The county doesn't work that way. The state doesn't work that way. The appraisal value is the appraisal value. Our money really be used for preserving trails, preserving the buildings on the land, painting them and things like that. We hear about Whippane Township passing the open space fund. Whippane Township is not interested in purchasing any more open space. They're almost, I guess, in the bankruptcy stage of their budget. That money for their open space fund will be used to paint buildings, pave the trails, and general maintenance. We've said here at the township over the years has done a good job maintaining their funds. If something needs to be done in Worcester Township, in the parks, on the trails, it's taken care of. So I think it gets back to money management. We've done a good job. We've been frugal with our money. We've bought a lot of open space over the years, but I think it's really now time that we have to make a decision as to which way we're going to go in this. So thank you, Rick.
Steve, I appreciate your comments, always.
Okay, I covered a lot of things. It's pretty interesting. I like facts. A lot of facts I've heard is there's $18 million in the bank. There's a thing between want and need, and I'm all for the open space, without a doubt. The one thing that he just covered, and it just came up, is you could have all the money in the world in that fund. If it doesn't appraise correctly, we couldn't buy it. So that's something that you're not touching on, or I guess we're not getting that message across. And I asked you on the phone, I said, you know, is there a way to opt out? And you said you can't write the law that way.
Pardon me?
We couldn't write the ordinance where people could opt out.
It cannot impose a tax and permit someone to opt out.
And it is a tax. And it's a 51-49 percentage to pass. Am I correct on that?
Well,
I'm asking.
let's do the procedure again. If you adopt the ordinance, it places it on the referendum for the ballot in November. Then the voters vote whether to impose the tax or not impose a tax. And it's not a supermajority, it's a simple majority of votes. It can pass by one vote, it can pass by 300 votes. That's how elections work.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot to be considered on that. I mean, that's a one-vote option. It's you're technically we're raising taxes, and we have the money in the bank. It's not like we're chasing money. You know, I mean, it's a difficult decision. I mean, transferring the amount of money was an option Steve brought up, $500,000 and put it in the thing. This is a 5-year commitment too. That's the one thing I thought this was an annual thing. You do this every year, and it's not. It's a 5-year commitment. And with the inflation, the $5 gas, all that stuff that was brought up, that's concerning because if you can watch the news and you'll go crazy. Are we going into a recession? There's a lot of uncertainty to all this stuff. But the facts are the facts. We got the money in the bank, so there's nothing we couldn't buy, within reason, at appraised value.
All right, if there's any more comments, the public here from the board will close the public hearing.
Right.
Public hearing's closed. Thank you for everyone's comments. Now the hearing's closed. There's a proposed ordinance 20-22-291, which would include a referendum question on the 2022 general election ballot. If you want to adopt that ordinance, it needs to be moved and seconded and then voted on. And that's the process.
Right. So, Bob, so I'm certainly prepared to make the motion. I'm prepared to make the motion, and would defer to you just in terms of what language that would need to be, and then obviously, so folks, if you didn't quite understand what Bob was saying, is we've closed the public hearing, you now have the item on the agenda, so it requires somebody to make a motion, and what I'm saying is I'm prepared to do that, and then it does need a second. And if it doesn't get a second, it doesn't get a vote. If it gets a second, it then goes to a vote. And I would certainly hope that we at least could get to a vote, and then we vote it up or we vote it down. But ultimately, if we don't get a second on the motion, it dies on the floor there, just in terms of the mechanics of that. Is that accurate, Bob?
That's correct. So if you're willing to make a motion, the motion would be to adopt ordinance 2022-291, which provides for a referendum to be placed on the general election ballot on November 8th. That would be the motion.
Okay, I will make that motion.
And it requires a second if it's to be voted on.
Do we need the Jeopardy clock? Right.
Well, I can make it simple. Is anyone going to second the motion?
Hey, guys, nothing from the audience, please.
Let's
Be respectful of.
This is democracy at its best. You might not be happy with it, but this is democracy, and you have to respect the process. So if there's not a second, the motion dies. Let the record reflect that there's not a second, and the ordinance or the motion was not seconded to even bring it to a vote, so the motion dies. Very simply.
Okay, then the motion dies. If there is no second? There is no second. Motion dies.
There's nothing to comment on at this point either.
Correct, because there is no vote.
No action item.
Okay.
So
So folks, there was a motion, there was no second.
move on to the, yeah, let's,
Maybe,
let's,
we have
let's
another
take a
public
minute.
hearing, but maybe just take a minute if folks.
You have to stick around for another public hearing. Yeah. No, that's right. That's correct. No one from the floor can second it. That's a governing body. Yes.
So a few years ago, I don't know if you remember, we hired a collection agency, so when people don't pay property taxes and things like that, we need to go chase it down. We have a collection agency that goes and does that. There was some state law changes that require us to tweak our ordinance that already exists. And this is the public hearing to talk about those just ultimately we need to have a hearing so that we re-adopt the changes the state requires based on.
It's just, we're conforming to state.
Correct. This one doesn't have any.
This is no big deal.
This is more administration than it is opinion.
I just didn't understand.
Nope, that's fine.
Michelle.
We good? We good to continue? Okay.
Well, my job. Come up here, sit sometime.
Okay, so we're going to start back up here again, guys. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for sticking around. Next item on it is actually another public hearing. It's going to be a public hearing to consider an ordinance as to the collection of municipal claims for certain delinquent accounts. And Bob, you will
Thank you
again
again.
grab
Let's-
this one.
Let's open the public hearing. This is for another proposed ordinance, 2022-292, which approves the reappointment of a solicitor and setting interest assessment, attorney's fees, and collections to be collected as part of unpaid real estate taxes. Again, the exhibits would be that the ordinance was sent to the Times Herald on July 5, posted in the lobby and website on July 5, sent to the Times Herald and the Law Library on that same date. The legal ad was published on the 7th of July, and the hearing is this evening. And I'm going to turn most of this over to Tommy, so we'll open the public hearing with those exhibits. But essentially, this appoints for Worcester Township, Portnoy and Associates that has been handling that for some time. And I'll let Tommy chime in.
Yeah, state law controls the collection of certain municipal delinquent accounts, and that collection process must be included in the township code. Recently, there was a change in the state law that requires our debt collector to take as a first step what's called the service of a validation notice. This change in the law will require a change in the ordinance, and the ordinance is proposed to do just that. In addition, there are some modest changes to the fees that are charged. The board will recall our special counsel for debt collection ordinance was set approximately 5 years ago. Considering the time that has passed, the amount of increases are, as I stated, modest.
Thank you, Tommy. Is there anybody from the public that has any testimony with regard to this ordinance? I think it's sufficiently described. Does the board have any?
It is. I mean, the only thing is we're keeping the same organization. Nothing's changing in that regard. It's
And
just
they
getting the language correct.
Yes, and they specialize in that.
Yep.
So it's the appropriate.
I know we've been very happy with them. I know
Yes.
the township has been happy with that group. Okay.
So let the record indicate that there's no public comment on the proposed ordinance. If the board has any questions, otherwise we can close the public hearing and act on the ordinance itself.
I do not have any questions. Does anybody have any questions?
No.
Then you can close the hearing, Bob.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll make a comment. Once again, here we are hiring a company to go out and collect money that's owed to the township. For whatever reason, the people decided not to pay their bills, and I think, once again, I'll go to my other comments that money's tight, and I think Worcester never really had this problem in the years past, but the past couple of years, it's becoming more of a strain for people to pay their sewer bills, and they're choosing what to pay and what not to pay. And the things they need the most, they're paying those bills. The sewer bill, although it's very important, that's something they leave by, or some of these other taxes, they're not paying the bills. So I'm in favor to move forward.
All right, so let's close the public hearing. It needs a simple motion and a second to adopt ordinance 2022-292, which reappoints the solicitor and setting the interest assessment, attorney's fees, et cetera. That's the motion.
Understood. Would either of you want to make that motion, or do you want me to make it? So I will make a motion to adopt ordinance 2022-292, which is an ordinance to the, as to the collection of municipal claims for certain delinquent accounts.
Second that motion?
That's right, I needed a second.
I'm sorry, I'm waiting for you to finish. Go ahead, I'm second.
I'm done. So it's been moved and seconded. Is there any public comment regarding the motion that's on the floor? Sir? Yes, if you could come up so we can. You just jot your name down and speak your name into the mic.
Frank Marino, 43 Hampton Court.
Thank you, Frank.
Question I have is, how big of a problem is this financially?
Probably the manager can
How
answer.
big of a problem is this?
Relative to other municipalities, we're very modest
Yeah, I got
in terms of
I looked at
the amount of outstanding debt.
I looked at the spreadsheet, the numbers. It didn't look like there was much in the way of.
Now, there are at any given time between 10 or 20 of our approximate 1,000 accounts in collection.
So modest.
Nothing. So, okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Is there any other public comment regarding the motion on the floor? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Aye. Motion passes. So next up, we've got a resolution. It's Resolution 2022-17, which is going to be a resolution for the reimbursement of expenses for the purchase of property. And also, Tom, you're good. This is not a,
Tommy Corcoran.
you're free and clear.
What? Oh, you want to for the resolution? No, I thought not. Yeah. I'll let Tommy take that.
Got it.
As you know, the board has authorized this purchase of a 40-acre parcel on Fisher Road. In the event the settlement for that property occurs before the borrowing of the funds to purchase the land, federal law requires a resolution which confirms our intent to reimburse ourselves once the proceeds of the bond or the borrowing are made available. And that is what it is before the board this evening. The resolution presented was prepared by our bond counsel.
Thank you, Tommy. Does anybody have any specific questions on this resolution? Just for confirmation, Tommy, these are just, we're going to incur as part of this transaction probably some expenses, and this gives us the means to say, hey, our intent is to reimburse those once we get all the funding squared away.
Yes.
Rick, I guess to Tommy, the question, I'm sorry a lot of people left when I asked this question. We discussed in previous meetings about the township purchasing additional open space in the future. Can you briefly go over the mechanisms involved in the grant process or the funding aspects that you would see that the township would be able to do, either floating bonds within the township or municipal bonds to be available at low interest rates for the township to obtain some of our objectives in the future?
Three primary methods to fund open space would be paying with cash on hand, dollars from our reserves. The second would be the issuance of what's called a general obligation bond, a tax preferenced borrowing on behalf of the municipality, normally payable over 30 years. And then the third, through a conventional loan through a commercial bank. I'll throw in a fourth, grant money that might be available to offset some of the costs as well.
So another piece of property came up, and we said, okay, let's do that. We just got through bonds or just the funding. It could be a variety of different mechanisms. Rather than taking the money out of our bank account like we did, there's other mechanisms that the township could use, much like a homeowner, on payment plans or some other way to purchase additional farms without draining. Someone brought up the possibility of having ambulance service, fire service, or other services in the future. We'd have to watch our balance. There are mechanisms in place where we could go to the government funding source to purchase additional property.
Sure. If we borrow money, of course, one of the factors there and how much our annual debt service is the interest. At this point in the market, for every $1 million that we borrow and repay over a period of 30 years, the annual debt service is approximately $70,000. So for the property we looked at and purchased on Fisher Road, which is approximately $2 million, borrowing the money for the entire purchase price would give us a debt service each year of approximately $140,000. So in lieu of cutting a check out of our reserve fund for $2 million, we could pay for it over 30 years at about $140,000 a year.
So as Mr. Betts suggested, that the township would take the money, $500,000 that we would generate, we said we could push over there, we could essentially buy 3 more farms like the purchase price we just bought and be in the same ballpark. I mean, there's other mechanisms. That's what I'm trying to say to people, that we're not against open space. It was just a mechanism that was, the objective wasn't the right time for me to do that. However, the township is in a position to do the same thing by floating the loans and out of the budget process and letting the taxpayers pay it. So it's just one way you do it or the other way you do it. So we do have the capability to buy more open space in the future over a 25-year or 30-year loan, depending on the loan we take out to make it go. So this board, and I think, Mr. Ryan, maybe that's something, in the next newsletter can be communicated to the public our plans, because we do have the plan there to acquire more open space in the township, and we have the objective set there, the year and the date,
Right.
and the mechanisms we go about doing that. So I think that's something that maybe we can inform the public. That's a possibility we can going forward. Because, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I was going to bring that up under other business, but that's exactly the, we've talked about it.
Yep.
And I don't want to we'll stick to the resolution that's in front of us, but maybe we'll talk about that
okay,
a couple
that's-
minutes
okay, yep.
in other business. Does anybody else have any other questions on this specific resolution for either Tommy or for Bob? Okay, and if not, then I would say I will entertain a motion if somebody would like to make one. I'll give this one to you, Lou.
Make a motion to approve Resolution 2022-17.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any public comment regarding the motion that's on the floor? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. So next up is other business, and Steve, I was going to comment and not put anybody on the spot at all, but, look, we took the steps to get an open space plan in place. We earmarked, 300 acres in 10 years, I think it was 300 or 400 acres sort of by our 300th anniversary. That was sort of the crux behind that, sort of independent of the open space referendum. That took place before that. And maybe what we can give a little bit of brain power to in the next few months is really how we mobilize that a little bit better. Because you're talking about, the argument is do you rob Peter to pay Paul, or do we try to find other revenue sources, and to do that? So whether it's grants, whether there's other mechanisms, but maybe we spend a little bit of time trying to sort of structure how that might work best. And maybe there is an outreach program, to your point, with volunteers, that there's a more efficient way for us to do some outreach to people that maybe don't want to come to a meeting here and talk about estate planning, but give them a mechanism to say, hey, we'd love to earmark endowments and different. I mean, that's what all the colleges and universities do in order to protect their futures. Maybe there's ways to do that as well.
Yeah, Rick, I think I mentioned in my short dissertation about being supervisors is more to the job than the open space funding, although it was a big thing. There's a variety of things we deal with on a daily basis. We see the numbers, we see the budget, we hear from people on both sides of the aisle regarding a multitude of issues within the township. We have to process it on our own, and I to that, I've been coming to the meetings for almost 40 years, and I can honestly say that we don't discuss this stuff there's no vote. I had no idea what you were going to talk about, and we don't do that. We sit here independently, try to come up with a creative solution that benefits the township one way or the other. I tie that in with the funding prospect, that there's other ways to move forward with this than the referendum. It's not something we're giving up on open space. We understand people moving to the township for open space. We're behind that, but we have to be creative to some extent. And that's why I've said, for estate purposes, if you have an estate, if you have money, that there's lawyers and things that work with this to try to come up with a solution for your finances, to have a legacy. You can donate a park or something that working within the township. So I think that's our steps moving forward in the next 6 months, developing another plan, and our eyes and ears are open. If somebody else wants land in the township that we think is a good price. That being said, we know, there's another surprise coming down the road. It makes Palmer's look small. And, the people, we're aware of these things, 6 months before it happens, before it breaks. But it's coming, and people think they have a right to do something with their land, and we have to sit here and hear it objectively and let it proceed. So not everybody wants to preserve their farm, and that, I guess, we have to work with people on that. So there's two sides of the road on that issue, but we like to at least approach these people and say, hey, can we help you out? What can we do to preserve it? If they say no, then...
Right. No, look, you are 100% correct. It's looking at it and saying, was there a way? I mean, I think this board has been very clear about saying that if opportunities come before us, we'll move on the right opportunities, and we've demonstrated that ultimately. So the idea behind, trying to have a dedicated fund is sort of outrunning us. At some point, where if you had a cycle with a board who wasn't as favorable to some of the things that we've talked about, then that stuff sort of outlives you a little. That was part of the idea with the open space program in general, was, Jim made some comments, about historically how that was a little muddied for a period of time there. And the idea was to get it into the, sort of out of the supervisor's hands to some extent, and put some codify it more specifically so that you can do it a more efficient way to residents and more transparent with residents. And, look, people don't always agree with how we do it, but I think we have tried to be clear in some of our objectives and getting those things taken place. So certainly as another business item, I think that's something that we can continue to work on, and we should. Do you have any comments to add on that, Lou? I just wanted to. Okay. Does anybody else have any other business they wish to bring before the board tonight? Okay. Ultimately, that was a question for us. Now we have a public comment, so if you have additional public comment, now would be the time. And then anybody else who has any public comment as well.
How you doing, gentlemen? I have a question.
Frank, can you do me a favor, just pull the mic a little closer to you to make sure we can hear you?
Hear me okay?
Perfect.
Good. I have a question, general question, regarding the building ordinances and the process. I'm in the business, construction management, engineering, evaluation, facility evaluations. And the first thing I do when I'm doing anything regarding acquisitions or sale of properties, I'm looking at an environmental report, that phase 1, test borings. When I have questions about how the value of the property may be or may not be, what they're claiming it, which I don't assume anything, or it's in today's environment, especially when you talk about Class A type of public funds and dealing with publicly traded corporations. What is the standard you guys are using for a benchmark regarding this procedure, with anything being sold or going to be developed regarding that process? And what's your exposure on this assumption of liability, responsibility?
So I'm not sure how to exactly answer that. Maybe you want to start with that, Bob, and I can add in whatever.
Yeah, let me try. So your question relates to when the township enters into an agreement of sale to purchase something, how does it protect itself?
Any development. How you protect yourself about any development. Let's say XYZ property. Unbeknownst to anyone, they did illegal dumping, short dumping. They did legal landfill.
So when there's...
They could have been at any property anywhere in the county or the state or in the tri-county area. The property is sold for development. Developer goes in with the belief that the property is clean. What liability does the township have in an assumption that the property is clean and it's good, that it is, and turns out that it's not? It ends up being contaminated with petrochemicals. Anything.
So Frank, so not to speak in hypotheticals, Bob, maybe you could talk specifically about the transactions we just had, what we did.
I can't answer specifically in a hypothetical what liability the township has on anything. It's impossible for me to do that without a specific set of facts. But I could tell you that when the township buys property, we include in every agreement of sale a requirement of the appropriate DEP level, whether it's a phase 1 or a phase 2. That's always a precondition. We also do site work. We also do site analysis. We send our building inspectors out. We send our engineers out. So we protect ourselves when we buy something. Your question relates to more generally when a development comes
Transactions.
in. We're not a participant in the transaction. We review plans when they come in. We are not a participant in the transaction. We don't enter into title in any way, so we don't have liability from a title relationship with any property that comes in here. The liability would relate to the allocation of risk between the seller and the buyer of that property. Our obligation is to review review the application, the subdivision, when it comes in through our engineer and our staff consultants. That's our obligation.
So whatever the developer turns over to the person they're selling, that purchased the property, that's at their risk?
Yes, 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 it is. And I can tell you, having done transactions privately, every private buyer does the same thing that I've advised the township to do. No private buyer would, in my opinion, unless they want to take a risk, would impose that risk upon themselves. But the township doesn't enter into the chain of title and therefore generally doesn't have liability in a situation like that.
So that person buying a single-family residence who believes that they're led to believe is the property's clear, it's clean,
Right.
and then there's no health risk, that's an assumption on their part.
No, well, I don't know if it's an assumption, but their recourse is to go against the seller of that property.
Okay.
If they buy a piece of property that turns out to be bad, environmentally bad, their recourse is against the seller of that property. And I don't want to get too complicated
I understand
here.
how that whole process works.
Oh, well, then you know the answer.
I got that pretty clear. My point is there is no mechanism inside to say when that they're taking a large parcel, where's all your environmentals before you do your subdivision work?
Yeah, our engineers look at that type of information.
We have an environmental engineer who goes out there, pulls a test boring.
Our civil engineer takes a look at that, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Jim?
Jim Mollick, Worcester. I think I have an example that'll help Frank out. The Nike Army base is a prime example of what happens when you have a property that you guys were looking to acquire, and they dumped all kinds of toxic chemicals at the site. You guys did your due diligence, did the core testing, found the problem, but the person who was responsible was not you, it was the Army. And the Army has to remediate the problem. Pretty much correct?
Correct.
Right?
Wish I would have thought of that.
Oh, I'm trying to bail you out.
He's still the best solicitor in town.
He is, and at the perfect price. Don't die on us.
Don't do this.
So Rick, I got one question for you. When you were giving your in-depth explanation for why you were going to go for the referendum, you were talking about your election, your upcoming election.
I did mention that, yes.
Yeah. Can you explain to me what your upcoming election has to do with your vote?
No, I was so it doesn't matter. But you had made the comment in your public comments about an election, actually. And I don't remember exactly how you had said it, but you were talking about the voters would speak. You commented about how voters would respond.
No, I said it's going to be political suicide.
Okay,
Right?
so that's why I referenced an election, that's why I referenced
I
it.
guess my point to you is, your upcoming election, did you factor that into your decision?
No.
Okay,
I
that's
think it
all.
would, no.
Yeah. All right.
Is there any other public comment for the board this night? Seeing none, then motion to adjourn. Thank you for coming, folks.